Welcome to our deep dive today.
Okay.
Today we're going to be taking a closer look at the death of singer-songwriter Elliott Smith.
Sounds good.
Um, you sent over some really interesting material with us.
Oh, yeah.
A document that is packed with forensic details
Uh-huh.
that really make you question the initial ruling of suicide.
Yes. This document presents some compelling evidence that challenges some common assumptions
Yeah,
about suicide,
exactly.
particularly when it comes to the specifics of how it's carried out.
And that's what I found so intriguing.
Yeah,
You know, we all know Elliott Smith's music,
of course.
and his struggles with addiction and depression were no secret.
Right.
But this document that you provided
Yeah.
encourages us to consider whether those struggles led him to take his own life
Mm-hmm.
or if something else happened.
It really does. It encourages us to look beyond those preconceptions and examine the forensic evidence
Yes,
carefully. And it reminds us that the truth often lies in the details.
it does.
Yeah.
And one of the first details that jumped out at me was the method of death.
Okay.
Suicide by stabbing.
Uh-huh.
The document points out that this is incredibly uncommon.
It is.
Could you elaborate on that for our listeners?
Certainly, suicide by stabbing
Yeah.
accounts for less than 2% of all suicides.
Wow.
And even within that small percentage, very few people target the chest.
Really?
In fact, the chest is actually the most common target in homicides
Oh, wow.
involving stabbing. So, statistically speaking, this case already deviates from the expected pattern
Yeah.
for suicide.
It's like hearing hoofbeats and expecting a horse,
All right.
but then you turn around and see a zebra.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It highlights how we often rely on our preconceived notions,
Right.
but sometimes the reality is much more unexpected.
And in this case, it wasn't just any stabbing.
Right.
The document describes it as a stab through the heart.
Mm.
That seems almost impossible to do yourself.
It would take incredible determination and force, to say the least.
Yeah.
And this is where the concept of hesitation marks
Okay.
comes into play.
Hesitation marks.
These are shallow, tentative cuts,
Oh.
often found near deeper wounds in stabbing cases.
Gotcha.
They suggest the person was hesitant or struggling with the act, almost like they were working up the nerve to inflict the fatal blow.
So like a shaky hand before signing a really important document?
Exactly.
Okay.
Those hesitation marks are present in the majority of suicide by stabbing cases, but the document emphasizes they were absent.
Oh, wow.
In Elliott Smith's case,
That is a huge red flag.
it is.
So we have an uncommon method of death
Yes,
and a lack of hesitation marks.
correct.
2 points that already cast doubt on the suicide ruling.
They do.
But the document goes even further, suggesting that there were signs of a struggle, right?
That's correct. One of the details that stood out to me was that Elliott Smith was stabbed through his clothes.
Through this
Research indicates that people who commit suicide by stabbing typically remove their clothing first.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It seems like removing clothing would make it easier, so to speak.
Right.
But in this case, the fact that his clothes were involved
Hmm.
suggests a different level of immediacy and possible violence,
Oh,
which doesn't seem to align with a typical suicide.
precisely. And the presence of blood throughout the house further supports this idea
Oh, really?
of a possible struggle.
Why would someone who stabs themselves
Right.
move around afterwards?
Yeah.
It almost sounds like a scene from a crime drama where the victim is trying to get away.
It certainly paints a very different picture than the one we might imagine
Yeah.
for a solitary suicide.
Adding to the mystery, the document you shared also reveals that someone helped clean up blood at Smith's house after his death.
Yes.
Why would someone need to clean up blood if it was a clear-cut suicide?
That's a perplexing detail.
Yeah.
And it raises questions about how the scene was handled and whether the initial investigation considered all possibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
It really makes you wonder if the authorities, seeing a troubled musician with a history of drug use, just assumed it was a suicide
Right.
without thoroughly exploring other possibilities.
Like they were looking for horses when it might have been a zebra all along.
Exactly.
It's a good reminder that confirmation bias, that tendency to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs,
Yeah.
can affect anyone, even those conducting official investigations.
Absolutely. We all have a tendency to see what we expect to see,
Yeah.
which is why it's so important to approach situations with an open mind and consider all the evidence.
Speaking of evidence, the document also delves into the toxicology report,
Okay.
which you'd think would be pretty straightforward.
Right.
They tell you what substances were in someone's system at the time of death, right?
Yes, but interpreting those findings can be tricky.
Yeah.
And this document really highlights that while Elliott Smith had prescription medications in his system, the levels were within therapeutic or even subtherapeutic ranges.
So he wasn't overdosing or abusing drugs at the time of his death.
Exactly, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
2 toxicology experts who reviewed Smith's report emphasized that you can't definitively link behavior to the presence or absence of drugs.
Really?
They basically said behavioral toxicology as a concept doesn't really exist.
So just because someone has antidepressants in their system, it doesn't mean they were depressed or suicidal at that exact moment.
Precisely, it's a correlation, not a causation.
Right.
We can't assume a person's mental state based solely on what medications they were taking.
It seems like people are quick to jump to conclusions about drug use, especially when it comes to someone like Elliott Smith, who was open about his past struggles with addiction.
It's a natural human tendency to look for simple explanations.
Yeah.
Especially when dealing with complex issues like suicide. But this case really reinforces the importance of evaluating the evidence objectively without letting those preconceived notions cloud our judgment.
It's like those crime shows where they find a trace of poison and immediately jump to murder.
Right.
But maybe the victim just had a really bad headache.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
It emphasizes how easy it is to make assumptions without fully understanding the context.
So let's take a step back and look at what we have so far.
Okay.
An uncommon method of death, a lack of hesitation, wounds of stabbing through clothing blood found throughout the house, someone cleaning up blood after the fact, and a toxicology report that doesn't definitively point to suicide.
You've summarized it perfectly.
Yeah.
Each of these details on its own might not be enough to overturn the suicide ruling, but when you put them all together, it does paint a different picture than the one initially presented.
It's like putting together a puzzle where some of the pieces seem to be from a completely different box.
Yeah.
It definitely raises questions about the initial investigation. Did the police even consider the possibility of foul play?
Those are the kinds of questions that need to be explored.
This document even mentions an injury to Smith's sternum, the bone in the center of your chest. Apparently, stabbing through that bone would take an incredible amount of force.
Yes, and in a similar case, a forensic anthropologist estimated the force required to be equivalent to roughly 145 pounds per square inch.
Wow.
The expert in that case expressed serious doubts that the wound could have been self-inflicted given the sheer strength needed.
So it's possible that Elliott Smith simply wouldn't have been able to generate that kind of force himself.
It's a very real possibility that should have been more thoroughly investigated.
And on top of that, there were those defensive wounds on Smith's hands and arm.
Small cuts that the medical examiner deemed incompatible with self-harm.
Yeah.
The positioning of those wounds, particularly one on his right arm,
Oops.
suggests he may have raised his arm to defend himself.
It's like each new piece of information is another clue pointing us away from suicide and towards something much more sinister.
It's crucial to remember that we are dealing with someone's life and death. This document provides a lot of compelling forensic information.
Yeah.
But it's important to maintain a sense of respect for everyone involved in this tragic event.
You're absolutely right. It's not about sensationalizing the situation, but at the same time, these inconsistencies are hard to ignore.
Exactly. And there's one more piece of this puzzle that we need to address, one that is central to many suicide investigations, the alleged suicide note.
The suicide note, yeah, we touched on it briefly earlier, but you were absolutely right. It's a crucial piece of the puzzle.
It is.
This document dives into some really interesting details about it.
It does.
So what stood out to you?
The note's tone in contrast to the violence of the act itself.
Oh, okay.
That's what I find particularly striking. It's apologetic,
Okay.
almost peaceful,
Right.
which seems at odds with the force and determination required to stab oneself through the heart.
It seems like a mismatch.
It does.
Almost like writing, "I'm sorry," while simultaneously punching someone in the face.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The document also points out that the note was short, vague, and not addressed to anyone specifically.
Really?
This raises questions about its authenticity and intended purpose.
It almost seems like it could have been written for Elliott, not by Elliott.
That's a possibility that can't be ruled out,
Yeah.
especially when you consider all the other inconsistencies surrounding the case.
Right.
There's even a detail in this document about Elliott's girlfriend who claimed to have found the note,
Okay.
mentioning that she frequently left encouraging Post-it notes around their house.
Oh, so that's interesting.
It is.
Meaning the note could have been written days or even weeks earlier, completely unrelated to his death.
It's a theory that should be considered, and there's another detail that really caught my eye.
Okay.
Several people close to Elliott said he never signed his full name, Elliott, in private correspondence.
Oh, wow.
We always just used E,
Interesting.
but the note was signed Elliott.
That's strange.
It's a small detail, but it adds another layer of doubt
Yeah.
to the suicide narrative.
As we've gone through this document, it feels like the more layers we peel back, the more questions we uncover.
That's the nature of a deep dive like this.
Yeah.
It's not about presenting definitive answers, but about encouraging you to think critically, question assumptions, and consider different perspectives.
This document has definitely achieved that goal. It's made me completely rethink everything I thought I knew about Elliott Smith's death.
It's important that we don't shy away from these uncomfortable questions.
Yeah.
The pursuit of truth, even when it's painful or complex, is essential.
So where do we go from here? What does this all mean for the Elliott Smith case?
Well, this document doesn't provide all the answers, but it gives us a good roadmap for further exploration.
Oh.
It highlights the need for a more thorough investigation, one that considers all the evidence, not just the pieces that fit a convenient narrative.
It's like the author saying, don't just take my word for it, dig deeper, demand answers.
Exactly. We encourage you, the listener, to continue exploring this case.
Yeah.
Read the full autopsy report, look for additional sources, draw your own conclusions.
Elliott Smith's death remains a mystery.
It does.
But this document has shown us that the conversation is far from over. It's a great reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries are the questions we ask, not the answers we find.
And that's the true essence of a deep dive.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and walking us through this fascinating document.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this deep dive into the mysterious death of Elliott Smith. Keep those questions coming and stay curious.